There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Hi there, it's Jessie dropping into your feed to share with you a very special episode of Extraordinary Stories that I know you'll love. It's a podcast hosted by Emma Gillespie, and it's all about cutting through the rumours to transport you to a story you haven't heard before. And the reason I want to share this episode with you is because it is a 3-part look at the Lindy Chamberlain story. I think about a year ago we did an episode on Lindy Chamberlain, and it was one of our most listened to. It was fascinating to look at how she was demonised, how the evidence was used against her, even though it was flimsy. It was absolutely fascinating. And what this Extraordinary Story season does is go even deeper. So if you've forgotten, the Lindy Chamberlain story starts on a cold night in the outback in 1980 when a young mother's 9-week-old baby girl was snatched and killed by a dingo. This single horrifying event would make Lindy Chamberlain a household name, thrusting her into a media frenzy and mishandled legal proceedings that would eventually land her behind bars for a crime she didn't commit. So here is the first episode of Extraordinary Stories, The Demonisation of Lindy Chamberlain.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
It's the 17th of August, 1980. A young family from rural Queensland have decided to brave the dry winter air of Australia's Red Centre for a camping trip. It's cold. Bitterly cold. The Chamberlains have spent the day exploring Uluru, taking photos, making holiday memories with their sons, 6-year-old Aidan, 4-year-old Reagan, and newborn baby girl, Azaria. It's just before 8 p.m. and the family are gathered around the campsite. Lindy Chamberlain nurses her baby, patting her back as she tells the other campers about their day. Soon enough, Azaria falls asleep in her mother's arms. Settled at last, Lindy places her baby gently in a carrier basket in the tent, next to her sleeping big brother Reagan. In near freezing conditions, Azaria is dressed in a jumpsuit with a singlet underneath, white booties on her tiny feet, and a woolen jacket with pale lemon-coloured edging around the collar. The 9-week-old is snug, and she and Reagan are sleeping soundly under canvas. Lindy returns to the campfire with her oldest boy in tow, where her husband Michael is still chatting. Suddenly, the howl of a wild dog pierces the still night. Then, a cry. Michael says he thinks that's the baby. But how can that be, Lindy thinks? She was fast asleep just seconds ago. Better go check. Lindy can make out the shadow of an animal leaving through the tent's opening. There's something in its mouth. Shoo! Lindy snaps, instinctively. Her heart is racing. She rushes into the tent to find something almost unbelievable. Her 9-week-old baby, Azaria, is gone. Her mother's eyes dart around the black desert surrounding them, but it's too dark to see anything. Lindy screams at the top of her lungs into the freezing darkness. Get the torch. Turn the car headlights on. Call the police. Get the trackers. But Azaria Chamberlain is gone, and she will never be seen again. Demonised by the press, vilified by the country, the subject of gossip and innuendo. From the viewpoint of 2021, the story of Lindy Chamberlain's case is a brutal reflection of 1980s Australia. Beneath the layers of lies and injustice, it's a story of a mother who didn't behave the way we wanted her to, how we thought she ought to look, act, speak, and how we expected her to grieve after the incomprehensible loss of a child. It's also the story of one woman strong enough to endure it all. Welcome to Extraordinary Stories, the podcast that dives deep into the stories you thought you knew, told by the women who really do. I'm your host, Emma Gillespie. In this season, we're unraveling the mythology surrounding the woman at the centre of Australia's most infamous criminal trial, Alice Lynn Chamberlain. The story of how a young woman went from mother to wrongly convicted murderer, and why the story of Azaria Chamberlain's disappearance continues to fascinate us to this day. Across 3 episodes, you'll hear from the people who were there during the infamous murder trial of Lindy Chamberlain, including the forensics expert who held the key to Lindy's freedom, if only the jury were willing to listen to him. And you'll hear from those who got close to Lindy, working alongside her to clear her name and honour the legacy of a lost child.
Storm of gossip, of misunderstandings and maliciousness, really, that has maintained an energy.
This innocent family, their lives have been absolutely ripped apart.
In this episode of the Demonisation of Lindy Chamberlain, we'll learn about the woman at the centre of it all, and how a nation divided in its speculation over her innocence to play judge, jury and executioner, all before she even took the stand, and how desperately wrong we were. News of a missing child always sparks intrigue. Children who disappear from their front yards, from the corner shop down the road, on family holidays. A media scrum follows these stories wherever and whenever they occur. But none have ever been quite like the disappearance of a newborn baby snatched by a dingo. The news of Azaria Chamberlain's disappearance and assumed death made headlines around the world. Shock and disbelief, the overwhelming reactions of the day. But in time, this tragic event would take on a life of its own, much bigger than anyone involved could have anticipated. Young or old, for better or for worse, it's a case embedded in the minds of millions around the globe.
You're all the way in Australia. Hey, I think I hear a dingo eating your baby.
I have lost my fiancé, the poor baby.
Maybe the dingo ate your baby.
A dingo ate my baby.
A dingo ate my baby.
Yeah, the dingo ate my baby. Very good.
I love a crowd just cheered. A dingo ate my baby.
A dingo's got my baby. 5 words from a panicked mother that would grow into a punchline. But on the 17th of August 1980, they were conjured out of sheer terror by a 32-year-old woman, a mother named Alice, who went by the name of Lindy. Her words pierced the night air when she realised her 9-week-old baby girl Azaria was in the jaws of a wild animal as it ran away into the night. Lindy couldn't know how her life was about to change, but she was set to become the central focus of a cruel and mismanaged murder trial for a crime she did not commit.
He just might have damaged or mauled the baby, and I ran towards the tent. I was only 5 yards away from it, perhaps. And I looked in a carry basket and she wasn't there. Well, I just yelled out, has anyone got a torch? The dingo's got my baby.
That's Lindy speaking with a news crew at the scene of Azaria's disappearance, shortly after she raised the alarm. It's a tragedy that on its own could break anyone, but what came next is a story just as untamed as the animal at its centre. For the Chamberlains, that brutal dingo attack, the one that killed their baby girl, would be just the beginning of a nightmarish chain of events. In the months after Azaria was taken, a coroner ruling held up Lindy and her husband Michael's account of that awful night. He found they were innocent of any foul play.
It's consistent with the possibility of a dog having taken the baby.
That should have been the end of it. After packing up their campsite, Lindy and Michael should have been able to go home to Mount Isa from the desert, from the last place where they held their baby girl. They should have been able to drive and never look back. The heartbroken family should have been left alone with their 2 sons to grieve and to try to rebuild their lives after a trauma most of us can't even begin to imagine. But they weren't. In the months following Azaria's death, Northern Territory officials weren't satisfied, and an open finding about how the baby died left scope for more investigations. And so began a relentless pursuit for evidence to prove the circumstances around this baby's death had to have been more sinister. Within 12 months, the coroner's finding that this was an animal attack and that the Chamberlains were not involved in Azaria's disappearance would be quashed. A young, church-going family grappling with the death of their child would find themselves on trial. Lindy, charged with murder, and her husband Michael charged as an accessory after the fact.
The so-called dingo baby case, described in many newspapers over the weekend as Australia's trial of the century, begins in Darwin later this morning.
A trial in the Supreme Court is about to begin. So much of what's happened and been said in private and in a never more attentive media over the last 25 months must be cast aside to enable a jury of 12 to make up its mind on the evidence presented to them.
But in the eyes of Australians, the presumption of innocence for the Chamberlains grew weaker by the day. The story that began as a harrowing tale of a lost baby had been rapidly transformed into sensationalist headlines and damning theories that would drown out any sympathy for a bereft mother. Malcolm Brown is a veteran journalist. He covered the case for the Sydney Morning Herald at the time and says for keen reporters, the Chamberlain case had all the elements of a good yarn.
Lindy was a very attractive and sexy woman. It was an exotic location. The public was fascinated by it. And for the tabloid news, the afternoon tabloid newspapers, that was a godsend because it sold papers. The Sun and the Mirror in Sydney, they were able to grab hold of that at a time when the afternoon newspapers were battling for relevance, fitted into them very, very much, just like Princess Diana fitted into the British tabloid very, very much. There were all sorts of other stories coming out that Lindy had injured the baby and that the baby might have been taken and disposed of in Ayers Rock. It was all rumours that circulated on rumours, stories that circulated on stories. The media was ready to grasp a lot of that.
Fueled by frenzied, melodramatic reporting, the tale of Lindy echoed around the country, dominating not just airwaves and magazine columns, but dinner tables and pubs in every corner of Australia. Could we believe she was a grieving mother whose life had been turned upside down? Or was she an evil murderer?
She didn't seem to be very emotional. She was very calm and collected.
Quite clinical, and she sort of became distant.
I thought she'd done it. I thought she'd killed the baby.
But it wasn't just the media's portrayal of Lindy that set people on edge. It was how she presented herself that would be one of her greatest downfalls. Desperate to regain control of a narrative that was spinning out of control, in 1980, just weeks after Azaria's disappearance, Lindy agreed to a sit-down television interview. A journalist presented her with a forensic photograph. It was of a jumpsuit, the jumpsuit baby Azaria had been wearing the night she was taken, found not far from the campsite in the days after. There was blood around the collar, but the suit was mostly intact. The question the journalist was pursuing was one on everyone's minds. If a dingo had taken the baby, why wasn't the jumpsuit more damaged?
They use their feet like hands and pull back the skin as they go, and they'll just peel it like an orange. And if you'll notice on here, on the hands, for instance, there is blood as well. And you also must realise that the baby had lost a lot of blood. And when you have lost a lot of blood, you lose weight, and she would have come easily out of her clothes anyway.
Her coolness horrified the nation. She described how her baby would have been maimed and eaten by a wild animal.
Gobbled it up bit by bit. That was absolutely off-putting, and it was the worst thing, the worst interview she could ever have given about having the dingo gobble up the baby bit by bit. Nobody couldn't understand how on earth any one mother could talk like that. And so the Chamberlains did themselves no good at all.
But the interview wasn't really what it seemed. It may have convinced masses of Australians that Lindy was guilty as many asked what kind of a mother could speak like that, so graphically with such control. It's true that Lindy seemed cold, but what we saw was the product of several takes and misleading edits. Lindy had become overwhelmed with emotion several times throughout that interview. She was told if she wanted to get her story across, she'd need to calm herself down. It took 7 takes. Eventually, Lindy was able to compose herself and they got the footage. And yet again, a brave mother's stoicism in the face of sheer horror was used against her. Malcolm Brown sees it as the ugly side of his profession.
Once you're dealing with the media, of course, you put yourself into their hands. The media is there able to select what they used, what they don't, what print, don't print, what they take and don't take, as you would well know. So Lindy certainly didn't intend it to come out that way, but it certainly did.
Lindy's demeanour fed into more rumours that began to take on a life of their own. The line between fact and fiction was blurring more and more. They were, well, grotesque and outrageous. But these rumours were selling newspapers. And lots of them. When photos of a small baby dress that belonged to Azaria, for example, found their way into the papers, what was an obscure and irrelevant item of clothing became one of the pieces that caused Lindy the most grief, and perhaps spurred on one of the most vicious lies. The dress was black with a lace trim around the skirt. It had a thin red bow around the neckline and matching red knitted booties.
The beautiful little black dress that Lindy actually made herself, she made for Azaria's brother Reagan.
This is Dr. Sophie Jensen. She's a senior curator at the National Museum of Australia, where this tiny baby dress now lives among a collection of hundreds of items to do with the Chamberlain case.
As she said, even when she made it, it was divisive. She said people either loved it or hated it, but she wore it with the little matching beautiful black dress that she herself had that she'd match with a little red belt and red shoes, and then there's this gorgeous little black dress, and she actually wore the little matching outfits for Azaria's 6-week checkup.
But a little baby dressed in black of all colours got a few people thinking, and soon a lie began to swirl that the Chamberlains only ever dressed their baby in black, that they were part of a cult-like religion, that Azaria was sacrificed. A Melbourne publication even theorised that the name Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness. As it happens, the name actually means blessed of God, but it wasn't from the Bible. Like so many mothers just like her, Lindy had found it in a book called 1001 Unusual Baby Names. Here's journalist Malcolm Brown again.
The false perceptions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that the church didn't believe in blood transfusion and that the parents hadn't let the doctors treat the baby and all that sort of stuff. It was all nonsense. They were wrongly mixed up with the Jehovah's Witnesses. It was all a lot of confusion about the faith.
A vile rumour like this made Lindy appear to be something she wasn't. The fanatical wife of a pastor from a strange religious cult. It made it easier for the public to believe what the Northern Territory Police would try to prove in court happened that night at the Uluru campsite, that Lindy cut the throat of her baby in the front seat of the family car. Something only an evil, disturbed woman would be capable of. Here's Dr. Sophie Jensen again.
The Chamberlains didn't react the way that people wanted them to react. They didn't look the way that people wanted them to look. They had a strange religion. The idea of Seventh-day Adventism was very poorly understood. Even the fact that as part of that religion that they were vegetarians in the 1980s for an Australian public was something to be quite suspicious of. Not crying when you expect tears to come. All of these which we see in different trials or cases or events, when people don't respond the way we want them to respond, people are very quick to leap in and judge.
A bad mother, a careless mother, an evil mother. Even in what should have been a small reprieve and moment of joy when Lindy fell pregnant after losing Azaria, would become a stick to beat her with.
then, the ultimate injustice, she was criticised for becoming pregnant again, and of course was pregnant with her daughter Kalia during her trial. And so that was another element in which people were all too quick to kind of offer an opinion about the appropriateness of the control over her own body.
The public lapped up every detail, picking and choosing how one thing made her guilty and another innocent. So infatuated were we with Lindy that thousands of people wrote to her, putting their deepest feelings, judgments and theories about Azaria's death on paper. Some, like this letter, tried to be helpful. They tried to give Lindy pointers on how she could be better.
Dear Lindy, how to dress in court for best acceptance of one's testimony. Elsewhere in the book, it suggests that crisp fabrics such as cotton or linen are more believable than clingy fabrics such as knits. Clothes that under-accentuate the figure are more likely to give an impression of authority. It also suggests that sunglasses create an aura of untrustworthiness. It suggests that a suit and blouse is best for a woman to wear for an impression of authority.
Dr. Jensen says whether it was a sundress, a suit, or a Hessian sack, there was nothing Lindy could have worn that would have pleased everyone watching.
Lindy's outfits were criticised no matter what she wore. People down south felt that she was dressed far too informally for court, and people up in the territory felt that she was too dressy, far too dressy. She was kind of showing off. So everyone had an opinion about what she was wearing, and she'd be photographed in every conceivable outfit. She would have given Princess Diana a run for her money in terms of how many magazines and newspapers were photographing and analysing every single element of her wardrobe each day.
Another letter from an abattoir worker theorised on the key evidence being examined in court. Supposed traces of blood splatter in the front seat of the family car.
Dear Lindy, if anyone believes that it's possible to kill a 10-pound animal of any description in the front seat of a small car without getting soaked in blood, they should try it. I've slaughtered hundreds, if not thousands of animals, and I know that I couldn't. Cutting a jugular vein is like burst garden hose. Blood squirts everywhere.
Around 30,000 letters like these that were sent to Lindy have been kept and now make up their own collection in the National Library. Granted permission to wade through them for research, playwright Alana Valentine stumbled across every imaginable opinion, including a hostility that beggars belief even today.
So I started reading these, incredibly nasty letters. There was one where a man had obviously ejaculated onto a pornographic image. Like they'd cut out a head of Lindy and stuck it onto this pornographic image, and then there was like a stain on the paper, a dried stain on the paper. And I was like, the most incredible thing was that Lindy had saved this and put it in the collection.
Murderer. How could you accept people's money to pay for your appeal? You are a wicked woman. You planned your pregnancy to coincide with your trial so you could get sympathy. You will never know a day's peace if you get out of the murder verdict. There is a judgment day for you too.
It ends with this epithet, from an annoyed, decent person. And bizarrely, so many of the nasty ones, there were a lot that were anonymous, but some of them would end with yours sincerely, or they would have their return address on the back of the envelope, even though it was anonymous. I find myself laughing, which may sound inappropriate, but it's actually why I'm laughing is because Lindy herself used to say to me, this is the comic relief. And it's a really interesting thing when you're taking on a story, or I've worked with other communities where they're carrying a huge amount of grief or trauma. One of the things that you as a writer do is look to how those people deal with their grief and their pain.
But Alana says the clearest divide in the letters was the opinion between the people that weren't there that night and who were there. The ones that didn't know the Chamberlains and the ones that did.
1986. Dear Lindy, my thoughts have been with you for many years now, and I do apologise for not writing to you before this.
I've always felt a special bond with you from the first day I met you in the Mount Isa maternity ward in the private bathroom on the 12th of June 1980. Azaria and Alicia were both born the day before. I cannot forget your kindness to me whilst I was in hospital, and both my mother, Di Collins, who has also recently written to you, and I have never forgotten your intense joy in your daughter, Azaria. I have also never forgotten your very true and intense grief at the memorial in Mount Isa for Azaria. You were trying to be fairly composed when you were greeting all the people leaving the church after the memorial, and then you saw me and we both broke down and hugged each other. Lindy, I don't think you know that I was a detective in the Mount Isa CI branch prior to having Alicia, and over the years I had personally dealt with child abusers and the like, and also murderers. I always had a special knack of knowing whether or not a person was guilty of what they're accused of, whether they confessed to it or not, and in all cases I dealt with, I was proved right. And that is why, since the 17th of August 1980, I have never once wavered in my thinking, said to as many people who would listen that there was no way in the world that you murdered your daughter.
On the 3rd of October 1980, about 6 weeks after Azaria was killed, Lindy received another letter from a couple named Bill and Judy West, who were staying at the Uluru campsite with the Chamberlains that night. They were in the tent next door. They wrote,
I'm afraid we are so isolated that until we heard the TV news last night, we had imagined that the forensic report findings had closed the case of Azaria's death, and we had no idea what you must be undergoing. We had never spoken to anyone, the police or the media, about the night of Azaria's death since. Anything we could have contributed would have been unnecessary. However, after hearing the latest news and reading Woman's Day, I realised how appalling gossip and innuendo can be. So I'm writing to say that if there is anything we can do or say to help, we will do so with all our heart.
But the campsite witnesses and character references from those who knew Lindy weren't going to be enough. 2 years after her daughter was killed, on the 29th of October 1982, a heavily pregnant Lindy Chamberlain was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in jail with hard labour. But even facing a life without her husband, her 2 sons, and her soon-to-be-born baby girl, even then to the public she maintained her steely resolve. Malcolm Brown was allowed to see her in prison a couple of days after.
I thought I'd find her absolutely distressed and shattered and crying, but she came out smiling and talking, and I didn't understand that, but I interviewed her, and I simply had to report how she was and what she said, which upset Lindy's lawyers because, I couldn't go and falsely portray her as being bereft and crying if she wasn't. And that's just the way Lindy was, how she covered her feelings up completely.
Escorted from the courthouse, Lindy was taken to a Darwin prison, where she would spend 3 years languishing, deprived of justice and tormented in her own personal hell, separated from the one thing that meant the most to her in the world, her children. It's only years later that the true depth of Lindy's despair, how she was really feeling, became known.
And their mum had to tell them that they'd sent me to prison. Which haunted her till the day she died. She said it was the worst thing she ever had to do was tell them when they woke up in the morning. She'd never heard a noise come out of a kid like that in her life before and never wanted to hear it again, with Aiden sobbing. Said he did these big, dry sobs. Was the only way to describe it. And that, thankfully, she didn't tell me that until after I came out of prison.
That's Lindy speaking to Arne Doe on the ABC's Arne's Brush with Fame. The characters that had been created for Lindy painted a villainous mother, one capable of killing her child. But as a real mother, Lindy's heart was aching for her children.
It's like when Regan hid
because he wanted to live under my bed in prison. And he hid, thinking they mightn't miss him when the officers let Michael and the others out, and then he might get away with it. You know, there's the things that break your heart as a parent, and having to tell them you can't. And he's like, I won't take up much room, Mummy.
Regan also wrote to Lindy.
Dear Mummy, I love you. On Monday, I watched Superman 2 and I'm not feeling well. The last few nights I couldn't go to sleep because I was sick.
Loves and kisses, Regan. And then he's got like 2 long lines of kisses, a long line of hugs, and a long line of sort of hugs and kisses together. I think that Lindy, you asked me what she's like as a person. I think that her concern always was for what the effect was on her children, the barbarity that was visited on those children. I think that's something people should think about when they think about a kind of mob hatred again in the future.
It would take 2 unsuccessful appeals and Lindy serving 3 years in prison before a shock piece of new evidence would set her free. A small woolen cardigan, known as a matinee jacket, worn by Azaria the night she was taken, was found at the base of Uluru, near a dingo's lair, almost 6 years after she went missing. Despite Lindy swearing Azaria had worn it that night, it had never been accounted for. Prosecutors had called her a liar, but now they had the matinee jacket. Even then, though, it would take another 3 decades and a total of 4 inquests before the Chamberlains could be cleared beyond question, and for Azaria's death certificate to state the truth, that she was attacked and killed by a dingo, not her mother. While it may seem like enough to end the bizarre mystery of one of Australia's most talked about trials, the long-term ramifications for a woman once labelled a baby killer endure to this day. Here's Dr. Sophie Jensen again.
It is fascinating when we have put different items from this collection on display that people's responses are still, they are varied. There are still a tremendous lot of people out there that feel that they want to offer an opinion about whether Lindy was innocent or guilty, despite the fact that after 4 inquests, a criminal trial, we know perfectly well what happened that night. People are still fascinated with that and want to offer an opinion.
Do you think some Australians still doubt your innocence?
Obviously they do. They tell me so at times.
People that you know well or strangers stopping you in the street?
It's only about 3 weeks ago since I got my last dingo howls.
That's Lindy on Network 10's The Project late last year. What has become clear, decades after, with the Chamberlain name cleared beyond a doubt, is the horror that young family went through and how quick the public was to entertain the rumours that condemned them. Next time on Extraordinary Stories, we've heard how Lindy Chamberlain fascinated a nation, but how did the endless rumours and melodramatic media coverage of her story play out in the courtroom? On the next episode, we'll learn how primitive forensics and a prosecution obsessed with proving murder put Lindy behind bars, how it tore a young family apart and divided us all as those who believed Lindy worked tirelessly to exonerate an innocent woman.
They were arguing about the assumption, even by the defence, was that there was blood in the car. Now, once there was blood in the car found in the places it was said it was, such as the front seat, that itself was damning to the Chamberlains. But the defence itself accepted that it was blood. In fact, it was not blood. There was no blood there.
You see something on television, you see somebody talking about what's happened and you make a judgment, oh, that doesn't sound right. I'm not sure I believe that person. They're not particularly credible. I guess all I could hope is that at some point we say of someone, maybe I'm not getting the full story. Maybe we need to rely on the experts to tell us. There are a lot of people who made a lot of money out of Lindy's story going bad, so that sustained it. But I always think there are people who make money out of the misfortune of PAC rule.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Extraordinary Stories. It was written by me, Emma Gillespie, and Sydney Peed with Holly Wainwright. Audio production is by Madeline Joannou. The executive producer of Extraordinary Stories is Sydney Peed. We'll see you next time. This episode of Extraordinary Stories is available free wherever you get your podcasts. To listen to the rest of the season, you'll need to become an M Plus member. M Plus is Mamamia's membership offering. And to find out more, you can head to mamamia.com.au/M+. That's MPLUS.